Hi, my name's Phil Skipper. I'm the head of strategy for Vodafone's IoT business, and it's a real pleasure to have Paul Miller here from Forrester. You may remember that a few months ago we had a conversation around the role of IoT, and we did that really at the heart of the first COVID peak. And at the same time, we were releasing a really interesting piece of research called the IoT Spotlight. And this really was the review of about 1,600 customers worldwide to understand how COVID had actually changed the way they use IoT. And today, what we're going to do, we're going to have a slightly different conversation, which is really about what sticks, what can we expect to see remain as we move on, because things are changing very, very fast. And I think having Paul here is a really excellent way of actually understanding a little bit more about what he sees in the market. So let me sort of give you a couple of numbers to start with. So in our survey, we found about 81% of the companies that we surveyed said that they were actually going to prioritize IoT higher than they would have before the pandemic. And 77% of those companies said they'd actually accelerated the pace of adoption of IoT. So with those sort of things in mind, I think the question comes to you, Paul. What have you seen really sticking in the way that organizations have changed their way of working to cope with what comes after COVID?
Hi, Phil. Good to be here again. And hopefully last time we spoke, we didn't say everything will be back to normal by Christmas, because we would look really stupid now. I don't think we did, so that's okay. In terms of what changes and what sticks, I think we've seen, as Forrester works with our clients, a real focus on pragmatic, practical, and tangible. You mentioned there from the looking very much at the way in which organizations were increasing some of their investment and increasing some of the doubling down on delivering solutions. Broadly, we see that too. I mean, I think one thing I would say is the big, bold, sort of broad, let's all go on an IoT transformation journey today, that's pretty much all stopped. If there wasn't a clear outcome, if there wasn't a clear owner, a clear champion, and some clear measurable things you could fix, that pretty much stopped as organizations doubled down on keeping the lights on broadly. But where they can see an immediate return and a way to sort of maintain business, they're absolutely doing more, doing it faster, spending more. And the kind of areas where that plays out are the intersection with IoT and other things. Mm-hmm. So, for example, IoT and augmented reality, for example, to allow you to have remote assistance. So you're operating a very expensive asset inside your factory. And normally, pre-pandemic, way back in January, first-class, gold standard, white glove service was to have an engineer from the asset maker turn up on site and service that asset. That's what you expected if you were a really good customer. That's completely flipped. And I think now you don't actually want someone else, these people coming into your facility at all, even if were allowed to cross borders. And of course, many of them aren't allowed to cross those borders. So the assumption changes. And what you actually want is helped any way that help can be delivered, often digitally enabled. So using augmented reality headsets or using augmented reality on a smartphone and using an IoT device to give that remote engineer real live data about how the asset is actually performing. And they then walk one of your staff through the repair or through the observation or through the sign-off process. And those third parties never have to cross a border, never have to come into your facility. And actually, you're also getting service faster too, because they're able to get on the call straight away instead of saying, we'll put someone on a plane and they'll be there next Tuesday. So that's a real change. It's also a change which absolutely is going to stick, because the assumption about what's good and best has changed.
And I think that's a really interesting view, because I think you're absolutely right. Organizations are becoming much more flexible and adaptable. Now, we call it future ready. And I think we're seeing a lot of companies saying, well, actually, how can I make myself future ready in terms of not only what I do, but how I do it. And those examples are really interesting, but they sound a bit sort of you've got to be a multinational corporation to do it. Do you see this sort of similar thinking applying to the SME sector?
Oh, absolutely. No, the SMEs are consuming some of these capabilities. So we've seen examples, again, back to the augmented reality piece. We've seen examples where SMEs are buying a headset and sending it to their customer and saying, we can help you, we can engage with you through this process. We see the same thing playing out in the IoT space, where those SMEs are either consuming some of that value or working with third parties and partners to deliver it out to their customers. And at Forrester, we talk about this notion of the future fit enterprise, which future fit enterprise also applies to the SME. And we see three sort of key factors that are important here. One is adaptability. You kind of touched on that. The other one is resilience. You kind of touched on that. And the third piece is creativity. Having that creative spark to go out and think differently about how you solve these things. And I often sort of paraphrase the creative piece as talking about needing to bring the human into the conversation as well. Recognizing, as we talked about last time, this automation, this sort of remote monitoring through digital processes is not about replacing the people. Absolutely, it is not about replacing the people. It's about augmenting them and giving them the skills, the insights, and the data to allow them to do their jobs better. And that's critically important when you get down to the SME.
And that, again, one of the challenge we see is when you move down into the SME space, who makes that decision? Because I think this is going to be one of the interesting things where, in large organizations, you've got a big digital transformation process, which is ongoing and grinding its way through the organization to make it change. When you have an SME, the decision-making process is actually quite different. Who's making that decision in the SME space?
Typical analyst answer, it depends.
Yeah.
And I think actually, the point I made at the beginning about all these big, bold, grand, fuzzy digital transformation projects stopping, SMEs weren't really doing them. SMEs were focused on an immediate, tangible problem. I have a piece of equipment with a customer. I cannot get there. How do I continue to service my customer? Let's think creatively about solving the problem rather than thinking about how I can employ digital technology in the abstract. So actually, those SMEs and those SME stakeholders are much more focused on the immediate problem they need to solve to serve their customers, to stay in business, to continue to have supply chain visibility as their supply chain fragments. All of these broader problems we see across the enterprise space. SMEs have them too, but actually the stakeholders who have the budgetary authority to do something about it are actually quite close to the problem. So they're better placed in a lot of ways to make these sort of pragmatic solutions.
And I think we see something which is very similar to that. And I think, in the Spotlight report that we did as well, 87% of the companies we interviewed said that IoT is going to be critical for their ongoing success. And when we reversed back from that a bit and said, well, what does that actually mean? It's about organizations adopting it for the operational technology benefits rather than the sort of the traditional ICT technology pieces. And I think that's one of the big advantages that the SME has, is that they can see things in a very compartmentalized way, and benefits that they get operationally in one piece of the value chain may well have significant value in parts of the other. So do you see that same sort of OT focus coming out in the customers you talk to?
Yeah, very much so. And I would agree with sort of the advantages you described there. There's also, of course, a huge potential risk that they need to be aware of. And that's deploying, half a dozen point solutions that are absolutely the solution to the problem in front of those half a dozen individuals, but they don't join up. So you have half a dozen fragmented, siloized solutions and no value across them. So there's still that important story to tell around someone taking a step back and looking across some of these solutions and saying, solution A is the best way of solving problem 1. Solution B is the best way of solving problem 2. But actually, solution C might be better there because it's going to integrate better with, solution A. I'm getting my ones and my A's mixed up. But having that awareness at one remove from the problem remains important too, and it's getting that balance between the two that's a challenge. And that, of course, is a place where some of the service providers can step in and offer a bit of guidance and help those organisations to steer through that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we see is that the reliance of IoT goes up. So it's not that they run processes side by side. There comes a time where you have to switch over and use one as the primary way of executing your business. And we sort of have an expression which is, we're responsible for our customers' customer experience. And I think that's where there's a lot of value to be gained in terms of your ability to rely on those service providers, not just for build, but more importantly in terms of the run of that system. Because at the end of the day, these organizations get the benefit of IoT because it enables them again to very much punch above their weight. But I think you're absolutely right. The selection of the right ecosystem, the selection of the right partners becomes more critical because your way of working fundamentally changes. And I think, COVID is quite a binary process. It pushes things in one way. Yeah. It's going to go back a little bit, but it's certainly not going to go back all the way. And I think it's been really helpful to understand from you a little about which ones do you see are really sticky. So as we sort of conclude, what have you seen that you've gone, that is a really interesting example of how a company has used this transformative time to really become future ready?
I think there are a lot of examples of that, but some are very simple. Things like the ventilator challenge here in the UK. Large organisations, absolutely, the likes of Airbus, the likes of Ford, the likes of Siemens, but also very small providers in that ecosystem coming together and using a range of digital technologies to take a small local UK company that made a very small number of ventilators and allow them to scale up to national scale very, very quickly with the help of large players, but also with the help of thinking through some of these technologies. The use of Microsoft HoloLens, for example, to train up Airbus and Ford engineers to make ventilators. The use of IoT to track those parts in the supply chain very quickly and very precisely. And putting all of this in place at breakneck speed, back in, when was it, sort of April, as the pandemic was at its height, and hospitals desperately needed this kit.
And I think that's a really nice way to finish, because when we look at what the report showed us, was 77% of these organizations now rethinking how they use IoT. And I think the thing which sticks with me is that this has increased the frequency of business. It's gone from being, a relatively slow, gentle pace to be able to deliver extreme change successfully in a short period of time. I think that's where many organizations are relying on service providers and IT providers like ourselves to really put them in that leading position so that they can overcome this, but then be able to succeed sustainably in the future and really become a future ready business. So Paul, again, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your time again today. Let's have another one after Christmas. Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Sounds good. Thank you, Phil.